We're a nonpartisan nonprofit membership organization, and our mission is to provide educational programs and also various engagement opportunities together with a number of partners to our three targeted sectors, which we've identified as students, young professionals, and community leaders, so that they may become competent and informed global citizens in this very complex, interconnected world that we all live in now. We encourage citizen-to-citizen diplomacy as a very effective and important way to promote peace and mutual respect so that all of us can thrive, including Cubans. So why does Nebraska care about world affairs? We're a very rural state, but annual surveys sent home with Nebraska students indicate that there are over 120 languages spoken in the homes of Nebraska students. Nebraska ranks 37th in terms of population in the U.S., but first, second, third, or fourth in a number of export categories. In fact, exports provide over 60,000 jobs in the state and represent about 9% of the state's economy. So we really fight above our weight class when it comes to international affairs. Our programs in the World Affairs Council cover a wide variety of topics like food security, conflict resolution, climate, U.S. foreign policy, of course, human rights, international trade, cultural heritage, and many others, but you get the idea. I'd like to invite all of you to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn, learn more about our programs and events, and consider joining us. So now I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Benjamin-Alvarado. Jonathan's going to talk to us about the U.S. relationship with Cuba and the challenges and opportunities looking forward. Jonathan is Assistant Vice Chancellor of Student Success at the University of Nebraska Omaha. That's a critical role, as any of you remember back to the days when you were students. It's not easy. He has a background in political science, U.S. foreign policy, international development, and national security. He's done work at Brookings and other presidential committees on Cuban-American relations. He's visited Cuba probably more than 38 times, doing research on topics such as energy, economic development, and he's conducted interviews with a wide variety of senior government officials on various topics, including energy. He has led a number of people-to-people exchanges in Cuba when those were permitted, and groups from across the country, and has participated in official delegations to Cuba and Latin America on energy development, national security, and a variety of trade issues. He regularly speaks on these topics in Washington and elsewhere. He is a native of California, received his Ph.D. from the University of Georgia, a master's from Middlebury Institute of International Studies in beautiful Monterey, and also attended UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, and Harvard. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Jonathan. And please mute your microphones unless you need to speak. And if you have questions, please enter them in the chat room. So thank you very much, Jonathan.
Well, I'm going to go for sharing my screen here. And so I wanted to do something really interesting for us first. I want to just provide us a little bit of a context of where we're at right now, and then maybe actually go to some questions, which I will answer. And then I'll just open it up to you folks to engage me with questions. You can, unmute or put it in the chat, and we'll go from there. I'll let Michael moderate for us on that. But I titled today's kind of interaction with you, The Future of U.S.-Cuban Relations, Challenges and Opportunities. I think it's very appropriate given where we're at. We have lots of challenges, but I also always see, I'm a sunny side of the street type of guy, so I wanted to kind of share that part of it with you. But let's set the table here. And I think for me, this is really the important part of where we want to get started. And just to begin, this is a painting from the Museum of Fine Arts in Havana. There's a period, they go through various periods. This one's taken from the Revolutionary period. And in its waning days of power, President Trump and his administration returned Cuba to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And it was a 180-degree reversal of the trajectory that had been advanced by the Obama administration previously, who waited till the very end of his 8-year term to make some significant changes. And I think it really kind of creates for us kind of that particular context and why that is important. So here's some things that I want us to consider before we kind of get in, and I certainly want to entertain questions from all of you. And it's interesting. because I've had the benefit of having studied this for well over 30 years now, that, aside of satisfying the demands from the Cuban American lobby, which is very powerful, very, very influential in Washington, D.C., U.S. policy of isolation vis-a-vis Cuba has really garnered nothing in terms of a U.S. foreign policy win for the United States, if that's how you want to look at it. Some minor concessions at the margins, as I put here, but really very little to show after 60 years of open and sometimes very hostile opposition to the Cuban regime. The other thing that should be noted here is that the Cuban economy is an absolute shambles. It's actually gone back to the future. And I'm referring to what Cuba was experiencing in the period immediately after the loss of the Soviet benefactor. And because they're facing a similar loss with the loss of Venezuela, providing them with free oil. And the core problems in Cuba are the same. There's a heavy dependence on imported oil for energy. There's a chronic poor economic performance owing to factors both external and internal, a lot of self-inflicted issues there. A very decrepit and obsolete infrastructure on the island. Everything, roads, water, electricity, plumbing, all of it needs to be replaced. It was all built back in the 1920s when the United States occupied Cuba. A steady brain drain of the best and brightest of Cuba's youth, highly educated, very articulate individuals going off and being beneficial to other countries all over the planet. And too few economic growth opportunities on the island for quite some time now. And this is a difficult situation because Cuba's economy shrank significantly last year in 2020. They had expected to have 5 million tourists in 2020 and only got 1 million because of COVID. And then even then, those were highly restricted to particular areas of the island. And so places that consistently used to see people coming through and spending money didn't get that. And then obviously the United States embargo against Cuba has had a profound effect because it does work. It has a very chilling effect on the extent to which countries other than the outside of the United States want to have anything to do with Cuba. And the estimates are that it cost Cuba quite a bit of money in the last over a period, but it's had a significant impact on both health and economics on the island. Cuba has to import most of its food. And unfortunately, because of the embargo and because of the pandemic, they lost a significant amount of imports from China, their number one trading partner, along with Canada. And it's been a 5-year decline that we've seen consistently. And so, if nothing else, because it really doesn't cost the United States all that much, the embargo against Cuba does work. Like I said here, Cuba's dependent on imports for much of its consumption. But because it falls behind on payments consistently, and this has been a chronic situation going all the way back to the 1980s, that trading partners are reluctant sometimes, even if they get a letter of credit, which are few and far between, to actually trade with Cuba because they're not certain that they're going to get paid for anything that they do with the Cuban government. Like I said here, the Chinese government had reported that it exported over $2 billion nearly in products in 2015. We're estimating that it's going to be less than about 500 million for 2020. But hope springs eternal on the island. There's a major policy shift that just occurred a couple of days ago, that the Cuban government is going to kick the barn doors open and allow private enterprise in a lot of fields that had been previously restricted. So they had mostly let Cubans operate small restaurants and maybe some arts and crafts kiosks, because they didn't want to kind of erode any of the control that the Cuban government had over a lot of the functioning of the economy. That's what you get in a command economy like Cuba's. But they have made a decision that for their economic well-being and wherewithal, that they're going to have to expand that significantly. And so it's been limited to 127 activities, things as simple as, repairing bicycle tires and a little bit of plumbing, to much wider expanse of building and construction and manufacturing opportunities for people on the island. That is going to be a problem in and of itself because it takes control away from the regime directly and puts it directly into the hands of people. We can have a little bit more of a discussion on that in a few minutes. So the bigger problem for the United States, and if you listened at all to anything that came out of the recent press release by the Biden administration, is that we've really seen no progress on human rights. And this remains a sticking point as it relates to the United States and Cuba. As I state here, elections are still a one-party affair. You have an aging and sclerotic leadership, even after Raul Castro stepped down and they put a 50-something-year-old individual in the role of president of the country, President Canel. And what's important about that, though, is that the vast majority of the senior leadership in the Politburo are still 80-somethings. And I have nothing against 80-something because my mom's an 80-something and I love her dearly. But there's no opportunity for that younger generation of leaders who don't know anything other than the Cuban Revolution to have any say in the direction of the future on the island. Something very important also happened in November where hundreds of artists and young Cubans met to begin to protest recent arrests and demand greater freedom of expression. And this is because something went viral by video. And it's really interesting as to how this has really kind of impacted Cuba. This is a scene from in front of the Ministry of Culture. And what's interesting, about 2 years ago now, Cuba allowed there to be free Wi-Fi on the island. And with the free Wi-Fi came an explosion of the number of smartphones that are available to Cubans. And even though they don't make hardly any money at all, as you can see, there's a lot of Apple phones there on the island, and people were taping. And so they estimate now that 7 million Cubans, 2/3 of the population, have access to the web. Many of them have access to smartphones. And in the same way that George Floyd was broadcast across the country, the protests by this young and very influential group of artists, cultural, tastemakers, musicians on the island really had a profound kind of impact on control of Cuban society by the government. And like I said, this is a problem because historically, Cuba has not allowed any kind of protest to not go unpunished. And there's a saying on the island, everything within the revolution, nothing outside of the revolution. And I think that, they can't take back, unless they decide to shut the internet down on the island, they can't take back what has happened. So that barn door has kicked open, the horses is out and running around. Like I say here, one of my colleagues, Bill Leogrand, who teaches at American University, says, this is an awakening of civil society facilitated by the spread of the internet and social media, which is posing a challenge to the government. And so to what extent does the political system, which prides itself on control, allow this kind of civil society expression that we've seen growing? And I think this is a critical question in regards to the Cuban government, because ultimately, at the end of the day, if they have been nothing else over the course of the last 60 years, it's been about control over the political system. So I'm going to go through a series of questions here, and I'll provide you with some basic answers. And hopefully at the end of this, then we can kind of come to a bit of a discussion, as I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that. So the question that I want to pose first was the Trump administration's decision a wise move to put Cuba on that state terrorism list? And why did it take its action in this waning days of its administration? And I would argue that the decision was a last-ditch effort to save face and deliver on the promises that were made over the past 4 years. This is very similar to, if you remember, President Trump's visit to the South border wall to kind of, tell everybody that they had had success. From my perspective, in both cases, this was meaningless, but not without consequence. The challenge of erasing the executive orders and the partial closing of the door for Biden has been made more difficult because of the actions that were taken by the Trump administration with those last steps that occurred in January. So what are the practical effects that the designation will have for Cuba and its relations with the United States? By placing Cuba on the terrorist list, this is going to force the Biden administration to reverse the Trump decision. And it will give credence to the argument that Biden is soft on socialism and kowtows to dictators, however you want to kind of interpret that. But I think that that's really going to be something that we need to pay close attention. You know, there isn't any real credible evidence from my friends in the intelligence community that Cuba is providing any sort of support for terrorism today. The narrative lives and it resonates with the Trump supporting constituents in places like Florida and Texas and across the country. This is important because it plays directly into the hands of a powerful lobby that really does not want to see anything other than a democratically elected government in Cuba. For the hardliners in Cuba, this also provides them with support for their contention that the United States cannot be trusted to advance relations. And so this is a double-edged sword that I think was very well played on the part of the Trump administration. They knew exactly what they were doing when they made that particular policy announcement. To what extent will the designation complicate efforts? So as I said earlier, well, I was on a webinar about a week and a half ago. Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who used to be our envoy in Iraq, she lamented that our relations with other countries are hindered by the constant starting and stopping, stop and go, reversals in policy from administration to administration. This is something that's been endemic in the kind of foreign policy portfolio of the United States for about the last 30 years, really consistently. In other words, we don't have foreign policies, but what we have are Republican and Democratic policies playing to particular constituencies and not to the countries in question. And I think that this makes it difficult as we transition from one administration to another to have any kind of really meaningful consistency in our foreign policy. And I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to. And I'm sure that I listened to Anthony Blinken talk yesterday. He's well aware of, and I think that they understand that there's going to be some work that has to be done in this specific area. Trump's gutting of the State Department, and I'm going to just say that that's exactly what it is. I had a number of good friends who left over the course of the last 4 years, many of them not Democrats, very moderate Republican. And our capacity to conduct foreign policy has really been constrained significantly. I do believe, though, that this is a short-term negative that can be reversed, but it's going to have to require some forceful action on the part of the Biden administration to do so. As I state here, I do believe that Biden will place trusted veterans of US-Cuban relations into a position where they can engender a modicum of trust in our words and actions moving forward and work to reinstitutionalize the professional foreign service as a backdrop against what has occurred over the course of the past 4 years. And for me, this is actually the most important dimension of what I'd like us to be thinking about in terms of foreign policy toward Cuba. It's not just Cuba, it's foreign policy with Mexico and all of the rest of Latin America that may be, that a lot of work has to be done. And I don't want to believe that the work on the part of the Trump administration was purposeful, but I think that, there were some concessions made to particular mindsets that I think we're going to have to work really diligently to reverse. So one of the things that I wanted to raise here is a point that has really kind of been underemphasized in our relationship with Cuba that I do believe can serve as a kernel for kind of advancing into the future. And that is, what role can Cuba's vaunted medical diplomacy play in clearing a path toward better relations? And something very curious is happening in Cuba right now. It's currently leading the race in the Americas for the development of a vaccine for the coronavirus. It's presently conducting 2 vaccine trials under the auspices of the Pan American Health Organization, which is the regional WHO for the Americas, Soberana 1 and 2. I'm excited about this because I've got a lot of familiarity with what Cuba has done over the past 30 years in this particular area. the Instituto Finlay de Vacunas and BioCuba Pharma are really kind of, committed to developing vaccine and providing it free of charge to all of the Americas and the developing world. There are significant logistical concerns, but Cuba has also been a global leader in the fight against Ebola, Zika, and dengue. And it's been a credible partner led by its Henry Reeve Brigade, which Henry Reeve was an American doctor who went to Cuba in the 19th century to help fight against malaria. And they subsequently have dedicated that effort in his honor. I would also like you to be aware that Cuba's been doing this for quite some time. They have had a cadre, if not an army, of medical professionals deployed around the planet to work in the poorest of poor communities and to provide essential medical attention. And there's problems with all of this, because the question remains, and I actually have some friends who've done this, that how and if these diplomats are being compensated, because the Cuban government has relied heavily upon the deployment of these medical resources to other countries to really kind of provide some financial resources for it. And the question is legitimately whether or not these folks are being paid anything more than a Cuban salary, which is paltry, maybe $50 a month at best in some cases, and forced to live in conditions that are really not optimal. And I think that that's something that does have to be addressed. So let me give you just a quick example of what the Biden administration has put out as its, and this is the only statement that they've formally issued related to Cuba, that our Cuba policy is governed by two principles. First, the support for democracy and human rights that will be the core of our efforts. And second is Americans, especially Cuban Americans, that they're the best ambassadors for freedom in Cuba. So we'll review the Trump administration policies. And that was a statement that was issued in a press conference by Jen Psaki, Biden's press secretary, on the 2nd of February. So given the broad sweep of regional priorities that I know are confronting the Biden administration, I'm going to kind of give just a few set of recommendations that I believe have to be central to any kind of policy that we roll out toward Cuba. The first, I would suggest that these would be the anchors as we kind of think about this. I do believe that given the nature of what we've confronted both historically over since the Cuban Revolution, but most recently under the Trump administration, that we have to engage in a comprehensive set of confidence and trust building measures. These are core in foreign policy relations, and I think that's imperative that we really kind of have this as our number one priority. Second, and I think it kind of alludes a little to what Secretary Psaki's statement, is that we need to facilitate exchanges, academic, economic, social, people-to-people, human rights, and the resolution of property claims, which still are a lingering problem. And my friends down the street at Creighton University are actually some of the most eloquent articulation of those issues as they relate to the United States. And at some point, I'd love to have an opportunity to be on a panel with those guys again. We've gone around the country and Puerto Rico and presented on a series of things that we did together in an edited volume last year. I think that we have to look for systematic and sustainable means of shoring up Cuba's known lack of liquidity. It's been dragging on for years, and the systemic inability to generate growth in production, especially in sectors such as agriculture. If you can imagine, Cuba's got a 365, 24/7 growing season. There's no reason why it cannot be agriculturally self-sustaining. That being stated, it is an abysmal disaster that has really kind of has been confounding for lots of people. I know that in the last decade that there were some delegations from the University of Nebraska that went down and did some exploring down there, and they could use a heavy dosage of cooperative extension. But I think in order for that to occur, we have to ease restrictions on technology transfer. We have to find ways to invest in infrastructure redevelopment, and I'm talking about energy, transportation, telecommunications. And I do believe that we have to grant access to funding for Cuba from the international financial institutions, primarily the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Inter-American Development Bank, to help Cuba to resolve its debt issues, because it does have significant debt that it needs to address. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And if anybody's asking, this is a painting that I saw. My wife and I were in Cuba last summer with my mom, actually, but summer before last with my mother. I got to take my mom to Cuba. And what was important about that was that we got to go to museums again. And this was a painting that we found in the Melia Cohiba Hotel in downtown Havana, and pretty creative. Vicky calls it my Medusa painting, but I wanted to share that with you. So I share screen, and I'm just going to go ahead and open it up to questions, because I'm sure y'all have some questions for me. So however you want to go ahead and do this, Michael, and maybe I'll give you the first crack at a question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was fascinating. A lot of updates I was not aware of. I have a question that I think others may have as well. What's the story on the mysterious illness that was affecting U.S. Embassy employees in Havana?
Well, it's actually got a name now. It's called the Havana Syndrome. And so, just to kind of to recap what happened there, no less than a couple dozen diplomats, both U.S. and Canadian diplomats, were afflicted with a very mysterious ailment that in many, loss of hearing, severe headaches, loss of vision, disorientation, en masse. It wasn't just one or two incidents. It was, like I said, a couple of dozen people. And some of them were impacted so profoundly that they actually had to retire and have become subsequently disabled as a consequence. And so the United States immediately sent down folks to investigate what had happened. And my understanding is that the Cuban government actually cooperated rather extensively to try to figure out what was going on. And no one really could at that point in time. This didn't stop the incidents of these occurring. Initially, they were at private residences where diplomatic corps was staying on the island. But eventually, it got to a point where some of them were actually staying at a hotel, the Hotel Nacional, right there on the waterfront in Havana. And some of them, were said to have, been impacted similarly there. So this was a huge mystery. The United States removed all of those individuals from Havana, and eventually really shut down the operations of its embassy there, and forced the Cubans to do the same thing, to limit its staff. And I did actually, a year ago this month, was in Washington, D.C., and had the opportunity to go have a meeting at the Cuban embassy. And it was a skeletal staff. And the same thing is occurring in Washington, D.C., in Havana with the American embassy. But what I have found out, and I've done a little bit more digging on this, is there was a series of studies that were done, articles that appeared in medical journals. And the best that we can ascertain at this point is that it was the result of a directed ultrasonic microwave radiation. Who had the devices? That has not been firmly established, but all the evidence that we've seen, and there have been some things that have been leaked out of the intelligence community, that the Russians were really at the core of this. Subsequently, in 2018, it happened again, but this time in Guangzhou, China. It happened to U.S. diplomatic corps working in China. And so there were then questions. So are the Russians doing this in China too? And is it only to U.S. diplomats? And similarly, those folks were impacted in the same way. And so the best, like I said, we can ascertain, and there were reports that were issued, both in medical journals, and then somebody leaked one of the intelligence reports that tied it to the Russians. But at the end of 2019, Gina Haspel, who was the director of the CIA, and representatives of the US State Department disavowed any Russian involvement. And so this is the debate that will, I'm sure at some point, perhaps we'll find an answer. Maybe we won't. I don't know. What is it that compels people to, if the Russians did indeed do this, because I don't believe the Cubans had the technical wherewithal to be able to do this, and diplomatic pouches can be a container now from a ship. And it could be very well that's what was brought into both Havana and into China in these areas. So I hope that provides you with a little bit better understanding of it. But we actually have a name now. It's called the Havana Syndrome. I know that two of the diplomats are permanently disabled as a consequence, which is, if you think about it, nothing good about that. So
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Val.
I see Val has a question.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was extremely informative. One issue that involves Cuba, not as directly as some of the other ones that has been very recently in the news, is the review that President Biden has ordered in regards to Guantanamo Bay. And I was curious as to your thoughts on that.
That I think for me has been very frustrating for lots of different reasons, because I would have hoped that 20 years after 9/11 and international terrorism, that we would have resolved some of these issues. I would have hoped that we would have put them behind us, that we would have adjudicated the charges against those individuals. But if some of those individuals have never been charged, they've only been they were rounded up and sent to Guantanamo with no end date as to when they might get out of the country. And I know there's a movie that's just been released. Jodie Foster, I saw her I heard her speaking on NPR about this, is that the Mauritanian, about one of the prisoners that spent 18 years and was finally released, never to be charged for anything. I think that has to be resolved. I don't believe that it really presents us in our best light. There were certainly legitimate reasons in the period immediately after 9/11 to try to kind of understand the impact of that international terrorist network, but the way in which people were rounded up, and there was no certainty as to if they were really directly involved or not, and whether or not are going to actually give them any kind of due process, is problematic. And I think it erodes whatever is left of our credibility internationally. It continues to erode it. I think, like I said, we have a lot of repair work to do in the international arena, given what we have, it just didn't happen in the last 4 years. These are trends that have been ongoing for a generation now. I think when I was an undergraduate back in the early 80s out in California, with Iran-Contra and all that craziness, I think we've been on that slippery slope for a very long time. And I think we have to figure out a way to rebuild that credibility. I think it speaks directly to it, Val.
Thank you.
Jonathan, Ellen has a question for you. Is the daily life today for Cubans as bad as it had been during the special period? And do you see demonstrations like the one you showed as possibly being a road to finding a solution for the needs of the average Cuban citizens?
Life today is vexing, is what I'm going to say. I think materially, the Cubans are a little bit better off than they were during the special period. That's not to say that life is good, though. I have to tell you that when I was there the summer before last, when I took my mom, that it was I was troubled. I was troubled because on one hand, like I said, I saw a lot more people with smartphones, but yet people had trouble getting clean water or sanitation. the plumbing was breaking down. And it's hard to balance, you know. I mean, on one hand, yeah, you want to have all the trappings of modernity, but there are some core elements to life that I still believe that Cuba has not, you know, addressed since the special period. I made when I was doing a lot of research down there during the 1990s, and it was mostly around energy and infrastructure and development policy and what have you. The thing that I said consistently, and I would say this to almost every public address that I would engage in, is that every day that we do not address the centrality of that particular question, all we're doing is putting off the cost and raising it for somebody else to assume that later. And the only people that are really going to do that is the United States, I'm sorry to say. I don't see that there's any internal mechanism within Cuba that provides them with economic wherewithal or the requisite financial resources to be able to do kind of massive infrastructural redevelopment. I think I did a back of the envelope estimate back then with a couple of my engineering buddies that we placed that cost at about $250 billion. I would say that that's raised exponentially since then because the cost of everything goes up over time. And that was a calculation that we did back in the late 1990s. And so 20 years down the pike, you know, I'm reluctant to say that, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it's probably near $1 trillion now. Think about this as an island that's nearly 700 miles long, and all the infrastructure that requires. They're lucky that they haven't had the major hurricane in the last 3 years, but every time that happens, the electrical grid is cut right in half. It's like somebody takes a knife and just chops it in half, and they got to rebuild it every single time. You know, we would have thought by now that they would have the wires underground, but they don't have any money. So here we go. You know, so life is tough. Life is tough.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. I have another question on the diplomacy. So who does the U.S. use as sort of a back channel for diplomatic relations now, maybe the Swiss embassy or something like that? And do any other countries also have gone along with the designation of Cuba as a terrorism supporting country?
No, I think, well, the only other country I think was like the United Arab Emirates or something like that supported, and Israel are the only countries that support Cuba being on that terrorist list. So, you know, I think that's something that can be, and you know, the United Nations consistently condemns that on the part of the United States. But what I would like to say to this is that I don't think we need to use the back channel any longer. I think that if we're going to be, you know, clever about how we go about addressing this, it's going to have to be direct, you know, interaction. One of the things that I wrote a piece in this book that the folks at Creighton put together was a volume of essays from Cuba scholars from around the United States on what the future relationship looked like. And I said that there was one integral element to it that really needed to be kind of advanced first and foremost, and that's the idea of trust. And so how do you engender trust, right? Well, trust, I think, is, I actually tried to create a bit of an equation for it. That's, you know, being a political scientist, this is what we like to do. And I basically said is that what trust will be the product of the reliance upon and confidence in the United States as a partner by the Cubans, and it has to be demonstrated over time. Reliance upon, confidence in the United States as a partner with Cuba, demonstrated over time. That, I believe, it will get us moving in that particular direction, but also fully understanding that every time we take a misstep, every time we go off course, that just delays it because the Cubans are going to be reluctant to want to engage. And the other part of it, like I said in the middle of in the presentation, is this gives all the grist for the hardliners on the island to say, hey, you can't trust the United States, which really, you can't trust the hardliners from my perspective. So we have to figure out a way to also kind of circumvent their influence on the island in a way that will allow that younger generation to be able to step forward. Because I know a lot of these folks well. They've gotten older. They've gotten older with me. I've known many of them for 20 plus years, and they're ready. They're ready to fill the breach. They're ready to move forward. You know, they are They've studied the United States extensively. They know, I think that some of those scholars know the US better than most Americans do. They've spent a lot of their life really beginning to know and understand that. So I just do think that, it's just the kind of thing that, like I said, we have to do some repair work in the State Department, our diplomatic corps. That's first and foremost, that's imperative. And so I continue to try to encourage students from UNO because they're good at doing this and kids from Nebraska, the foreign service and the intelligence community loves kids from the Midwest. Why? Because their feet are firmly planted on the ground. Always have been. I remember we hosted George Tenet many years ago here at UNO. And one of the things he shared with students at the time, he spoke to a group of 50 students, took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, loosened his tie. And he said the best analyst he ever hired was a girl from Denison, Iowa, because her feet were firmly planted on the ground.
Oh, thanks for that, Jonathan. I see Andy Schilling has a couple of questions. Andy, would you like to jump in?
Yes, hi. Good morning, Professor, and thanks for that great coverage of kind of the whole period of Cuba relations that I recall in my life as well. So I'd like to segue just off of your last comment in terms of the State Department. I'm a retired State Department officer, and again, these past 4 years I look upon as an anomaly in our own foreign relations, and it's refreshing and exciting to see that under Biden there's a return to what was historic, rational, principled foreign policy. So it's really a period of reconstruction, and it's a very exciting period. So for those UNO students, I would encourage them to know this is a great opportunity to be a part of that rebuilding of trust and confidence and to re-knowing the US. So having said that, I'd like to go back though, because I can remember in my period in the State Department, which began back in the 80s, there has been, I don't see that the Trump, it was a kind of fist in the face kind of policy, to really, you're on the terrorist list as well, but there have been US policies coming from Congress like Helms-Burton from the 90s that were very directed against Cuba, very, I think from our own side, from hardliners, supported in that regard, and made relationships with European partners difficult because those also overlapped into, we'll sue you in European courts to get those assets back and so forth. But the anecdote I want to say, so I was in Poland in like the 2000s, and a Republican ambassador, as we were talking at lunch, just kind of commented and said, kind of makes you wonder, why you stick with a policy that really hasn't worked for about 60 years, huh? And that throws me over to positing this. What if we, instead of did the hard line and the economic sanctions, which, in one sense they're working. I mean, it's destroyed the economy. But in another, it's not worked, because I think the purpose of those is to topple the government. It's supposed to be the people will rise up, they'll finally throw off the shackles and will take over. But that hasn't happened. It's just made their lives even more miserable. What if we go to the opposite end, like we did with Eastern Europe, and you think of, East Berlin or Eastern Germany surrounded by the wealth of Europe, and they could look across a wall and say, geez, they're living in color on that side of the wall. We're still in black and white over here. And I think that had a great contribution to the fall of the wall in '89. So what about opening up relations? And as some of our colleagues have said, let's get the exchanges going. Let's get some people back and forth, the people to people. But even more, what about having a positive embrace? Couldn't that do even more to effect that kind of change that we've been trying to get for 60 plus years? So again, I was working in exchanges and public diplomacy my 30 years in the State Department, so I'm a believer, and that's kind of the choir you're preaching to. Thanks for the question.
Well, this is what's important about that for me, and I really appreciate the fact that you've raised that. So it would make sense, right, that if we were to more fully embrace and engage opportunity, as opposed to, it's you bring the horse an apple, or you bring the horse a stick. What are you going to do? And I think that's a carrot and stick and analog. I mean, the metaphor is also very useful here. And I was actually disappointed with the Obama administration that it waited till its last year to really kind of institute the changes that had a very significant. And I mean, let me tell you, I was in Cuba about a week after those initial announcements were made in 2015. And boy, the amount of just joy on the streets in Havana were palpable. And I think that had he started that process earlier, I think that would have had a more profound impact. But like I said, part of it is we have to try to figure a way to condition the response of the hardliners on the island, because there still is this, you know, they hold the historical figures, a revolutionary generation, in such high esteem, very similar to what we did with our greatest generation here in the United States, you know. And so, and yet at the very same time, knowing that those guys are the culprits for some of the self-inflicted, you know, wounds that the Cubans have had to endure. So part of the reason why the United States has continued to have the foreign policy that it's had with Cuba, because it hasn't cost us anything. Had there been a palpable cost to the United States foreign policy portfolio, you know, in terms of being hard on Cuba, you know, that I think we would have seen changes sooner. But I think that we're still frozen in 1963. That's when we settled on the policy that we have today. You know, it's going to turn 60 years old in 2 years. My hope is that we've moved beyond that in the next year or so. But like, I echo what you have to say in terms of the rebuilding. The one thing I would add is that we did have a project here at UNO that was funded by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to try to really kind of gin up more interest and support, both in students entering the intelligence community, but also in entering foreign service. And it was with a specific interest of really helping to diversify that workforce for Uncle Sam, knowing that, you know, you've already retired, people like me, I'm going to retire here in a few years, you know, that we need to find a way to have young people to go and do that kind of work. That is the work of the nation. And I tell students this all the time. I said, you can really aspire to nothing higher in terms of, if you really want to serve your nation, to do this type of work. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to come of it. I do know that, I'm on this group with folks at Georgetown with Ambassador Bodine is the director there. She's remarkable, and I think we need to have her out, maybe banging the drum more. I mean, I believe the Biden administration needs to appoint her as kind of like the ambassador for the Foreign Service, because I mean, she does such a remarkable job of doing it. She's always done that, but you know, the other thing that's happened there is that the Biden administration took all her people away from her. Now they're all back in government working, so that happens too. I think we got time for a couple of more questions. Does anybody have a question? Val, did you have your hand up again?
Yes, I did. You mentioned very briefly China in regards to the impact that the trade between the two countries is currently at. I was wondering if you might expand a little bit more on the China-Cuba relations. I recently read an article where China is very involved in expanding its influence in Latin America. And I was wondering what you're seeing happening in regards to this push by China as far as Cuba is concerned.
You know, China's been positioning itself for the last 15 years on the island. Yeah, going back to about 2000 or so, to really have a much more pronounced impact and influence over not only Cuba, but all of Latin America. I saw it in Peru when I was there. I've seen it in Brazil when I was there. I don't know if Sao Paulo has 2 tankers full of iron ore going to China every month, full of iron ore from Brazil. The Chinese have been instrumental in building a deep water port in Mariel for Cuba, knowing that with the changes at the Panama Canal, that's going to open up that as an opportunity. You know, like I said, because Cuba doesn't have any access to international finance, and the Chinese are not willing to assume that responsibility by themselves, I've seen in other countries in Latin America where there is kind of investment from the International Inter-American Development Bank and the IMF and what have you, that the Chinese will go anywhere where they see an opportunity. This is why they're drilling oil in the South Sudan, and I think it's imperative for us to know and understand that. That doesn't mean that it's a zero sum, that if the Chinese have influence in Cuba, that the United States can't be a partner as well. Because my assessment is that whenever I know and understand what has gone on in Cuba, at the end of the day, the Cubans want to be working with Americans first. They want to be having access to US technology. They want to have access to US institutions and Americans. So that being said, I think it's imperative that we try to position ourselves both strategically, but also very instrumentally to be able to fill that role. And I think that our foreign policy has hindered us in that particular area. There's a great book that was written back in the 1990s called On Becoming Cuban. Luis Perez Jr., who was professor of history at the University of North Carolina, did this kind of analysis of the parallels of both development in the United States and Cuba from the end of the 19th century to 1960. And guess what? It's almost in lockstep. Railroad in Cuba before there's railroad in England. Air conditioning in Cuba before there's air conditioning anywhere else in the world. Carrier air conditioners from the 1950s are still clunking along. Now, granted, all they're basically doing is recirculating the air, not cooling anything. but it goes to say that so many of the trappings of modernity that were available in the United States were also being developed in parallel in Cuba. And the book really detailed the extent to which shared affinities around technology, around movies, around baseball, between these two countries that I believe have always been the kernel of how we can maybe reconfigure our relationship with Cuba. We just haven't allowed it to occur. Now, granted, I wasn't around during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I can't possibly imagine what a scare that put into people. And now knowing what we know, that they were this close to actually deploying nuclear weapons. I did get to attend the 30-year event in Cuba where Dean Rusk and many of the other principals that were involved on the ground and many of the Russians and Cubans were all in the same room. I was a grad student then, and I got to observe it. It scared the living daylights out of me when they told us exactly what was going on. So we dodged a bullet there, and maybe we haven't been able to forgive the Cubans for that one, but because they were there because of Castro's invitation.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, I was actually one of those kids that you see in the black and white clips with their huddled up under their desk on those drills during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Crazy.
So, Jonathan, I just have a quick one. We just have a couple minutes left, but on the energy front, so Russia's gone, Venezuela's gone. Do you see an opportunity for Iran to step in and supply oil to Cuba? They love messing with our own backyard.
That would be ridiculous, and it would be really unfortunate if such were to occur. I'm really good friends with the dean of the Jackson School of Geophysics at the University of Texas, and we've got a boilerplate plan ready to launch tomorrow. All we need is a green light to go in there and begin shipping oil and technology from the Gulf Coast to Cuba. There's always been this natural affinity, and the work that I've done in the energy camp is that's exactly what the Cubans want. But they want to move away from oil. They want to move toward wind and solar. I mean, Cuba's got wind. They got lots and lots of sun. They've got lots of natural gas. I mean, I think that its energy problems would be solved immediately if they had access to more, open relations with the United States. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. Well, we're out of time. I know there are many more questions, but I want to thank you, Jonathan, and also thank you for everybody who tuned in today. We are recording this event and we'll post it on our YouTube site in the next couple of days. And I just want to let people know that our next virtual Zoom presentation will be on March 10th at noon. And that will be an examination of Nebraska's foreign trade activities. So thank you very much again, Jonathan, and have a warm day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks very much, Professor. That was great. Have a good one.
Good. You too.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I'll unmute myself to say yes, and muchas gracias, como siempre, por su ayuda y por todo. Muy buen discurso y muy buena presentación.
Gracias, mi amiga.
Y que pase muy buen día.
Igualmente, gracias. Bye, Betty. Thank you for everything.
Bye. Thank you.